In the year 48 after Christ, the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire stripped naked in front of hundreds of men and began what ancient historians called the most degrading competition in Roman history. Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius and mother to the future Emperor Britannicus, had just entered a prostitution contest against Rome's most experienced courtesans. But here's the shocking part. She won. This wasn't a moment of madness or a single lapse in judgment. According to Roman historian Pliny the Elder, Messalina regularly engaged in such competitions, defeating professional prostitutes by servicing 25 men in a single night. The same woman who held the title of Augusta, who could command legions and influence the fate of the empire, was simultaneously operating what amounted to a high-end brothel from within the imperial palace itself. But the truth behind Messalina's scandalous behavior is far more complex and politically charged than simple nymphomania. What appears to be sexual deviance was actually part of a calculated political strategy that would ultimately reshape the Roman Empire and cost her everything, including her life at just 28 years old. Picture Rome in the 1st century after Christ, a city of over 1 million inhabitants, the beating heart of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf. The Palatine Hill rises above the chaos of the streets, crowned with marble palaces where the most powerful people in the known world make decisions that affect millions of lives. Within these walls, political intrigue, assassination plots, and sexual scandals unfold daily. But nothing in Roman history compares to the reign of terror orchestrated by one woman. Valeria Messalina wasn't born into royalty. She was the product of careful political calculation, married to the stammering, limping Claudius when he seemed destined to remain a scholarly footnote in imperial history. When Caligula's assassination suddenly thrust Claudius onto the throne in 41 after Christ, Messalina found herself transformed overnight from a minor aristocrat into the most powerful woman in the world. What she did with that power would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. Ancient sources describe a woman who used sex as a weapon, blackmail as currency, and murder as a solution to political problems. She allegedly forced senators' wives into prostitution, orchestrated the deaths of anyone who opposed her, and accumulated wealth and influence through a network of sexual and political corruption that reached into every corner of Roman society. But was Messalina truly the monster described by ancient historians? Or was she a victim of political propaganda designed to discredit her memory? Modern scholarship suggests the truth lies somewhere between myth and reality, in a world where women had to navigate impossible political pressures using the only tools available to them. The story of Messalina reveals the dark underbelly of imperial power, where political survival often required moral compromise, and where the line between victim and perpetrator became impossibly blurred. Her rise and fall illuminate not just the corruption of individual power, but the systemic problems that would eventually tear the Roman Empire apart from within. Before we dive deeper into this tale of power, corruption, and ultimate destruction, let me make a quick invitation. If you're new to the channel and enjoying this content, subscribe and hit the like button to help the channel grow. Now, let's return to ancient Rome and uncover the truth behind one of history's most scandalous figures. The question isn't whether Messalina was guilty of the crimes attributed to her, but why her story became so central to Roman political discourse that it survived for 2,000 years. But to understand how a young aristocratic woman became synonymous with corruption and sexual excess, we must first examine the world that created her and the impossible circumstances that shaped her choices. Valeria Messalina was born around 20 after Christ into a world where women's lives were entirely determined by the political ambitions of men. Her father, Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, belonged to one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families, with bloodlines that trace back to the earliest days of the Republic. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, was the niece of Emperor Augustus, making Messalina part of the complex web of imperial family connections that determined who lived, who died, and who held power in 1st century Rome. The Rome of Messalina's youth was a city of stark contradictions. Public morality laws prohibited adultery and prescribed severe punishments for sexual misconduct. Yet the imperial court was notorious for its debauchery and political murders. Women were legally considered perpetual minors, unable to vote, hold office, or own property independently. Yet the mothers, wives, and daughters of emperors wielded enormous unofficial influence over the fate of the empire. Messalina's marriage to Claudius around 38 after Christ appeared to be a political dead end. Claudius was 50 years old, physically disabled with a pronounced limp and speech impediment, and seemingly destined to remain a harmless scholar writing histories in the shadows of more powerful relatives. Contemporary sources describe him as an embarrassment to the imperial family, someone kept out of public view to avoid damaging the dignity of Roman leadership. But appearances in imperial Rome were often deceiving. Claudius possessed one of the sharpest minds of his generation, with an encyclopedic knowledge of Roman law, history, and government administration. His apparent weakness was actually a survival strategy in a family where intelligence and ambition typically resulted in assassination. While his brothers and cousins plotted against each other and met violent deaths, Claudius lived precisely because everyone underestimated him. The assassination of Caligula on January 24, 41 after Christ, changed everything. When the Praetorian Guard discovered Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the Imperial palace, terrified for his life, they proclaimed him emperor not because of his qualifications, but because he was the last adult male in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Suddenly, the stammering scholar was master of the Roman world, and his young wife Messalina found herself Augusta, First Lady of the Empire. Historical sources suggest that Messalina immediately recognized the precariousness of their position. Claudius had no military experience, no popular support, and no political allies. His claim to the throne rested entirely on his bloodline and the temporary support of the Praetorian Guard. In such circumstances, survival required building a network of loyal supporters quickly, and Messalina understood that in Rome, loyalty was often purchased with favors, money, or access to power. The traditional tools of imperial women, marriage alliances, religious ceremonies, and charitable works, were insufficient for the scale of political challenges they faced. Messalina needed something more direct, more immediate, and more personally compelling. According to ancient sources, she found her answer in sexual politics, using her body and her position to create a web of compromising relationships that gave her leverage over senators, generals, and court officials. Tacitus describes Messalina's early years as Augusta as a period of increasing boldness and experimentation. She began by hosting elaborate dinner parties where the boundaries between political discussion and sexual entertainment became deliberately blurred. Senators who attended these gatherings found themselves drawn into compromising situations, creating mutual dependencies that Messalina could exploit when she needed political support. But the dinner parties were only the beginning. Ancient sources claim that Messalina established what amounted to a parallel court system, where political decisions were made based on personal relationships rather than official government channels. Appointments to military commands, judicial positions, and provincial governorships increasingly depended on maintaining good relations with the empress, and maintaining those relations often involved participating in her elaborate sexual games. The historical record suggests that Messalina's behavior became progressively more extreme and public as she gained confidence in her power. What began as private dinner parties evolved into semi-public performances where senators' wives were allegedly forced to compete in sexual contests for the entertainment of the imperial court. These events served multiple purposes. They provided blackmail material against potential enemies, created bonds of shared corruption among participants, and demonstrated Messalina's absolute power over Roman society's most prominent families. Contemporary observers were horrified by these developments, but their horror was complicated by the undeniable effectiveness of Messalina's methods. During the early years of Claudius's reign, political stability improved dramatically. The constant conspiracies and assassinations that had characterized Caligula's rule largely ceased, not because people became more moral, but because potential conspirators were too compromised by their involvement with Messalina to risk opposing the imperial regime. The psychological dynamics underlying Messalina's behavior remain a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians argue that she was driven by genuine sexual compulsion, while others suggest that her actions were entirely calculated political theater. The truth likely combines elements of both interpretations. Growing up in a world where women's value was measured entirely in terms of their relationships with men, Messalina may have discovered that sexual power was the only form of agency available to her. The Roman aristocracy's response to Messalina's behavior was characterized by public condemnation and private participation. Senators who denounced imperial corruption in their speeches often attended the empress's parties, creating a culture of hypocrisy that undermined traditional Roman moral authority. This erosion of moral legitimacy would have profound consequences for the empire's long-term stability, but in the short term, it served Messalina's purposes perfectly. But what nobody expected was that Messalina's greatest scandal was yet to come, and when it finally erupted, it would reveal the true extent of her political ambitions and ultimately cost her everything she had worked to build. By 45 after Christ, Messalina's influence over Roman politics had reached unprecedented levels. Ancient sources describe her as operating what amounted to a shadow government, making decisions about provincial appointments, military commands, and even judicial verdicts based on her personal relationships and financial interests. But her most audacious move was yet to come, and it would involve a direct challenge to the fundamental principles of Roman marriage law and imperial succession. The catalyst for Messalina's ultimate downfall was her relationship with Gaius Silius, described by Tacitus as the most handsome young man in Rome. Silius was not just another sexual conquest. He was a rising political star with significant wealth, military connections, and aristocratic credentials that made him a potential alternative to Claudius as emperor. What began as an affair evolved into something far more dangerous. A formal marriage ceremony that challenged the very foundations of imperial legitimacy. According to Tacitus, the marriage between Messalina and Silius was celebrated with full religious ceremonies in 48 after Christ, while Claudius was away in the port city of Ostia overseeing grain shipments. The wedding feast allegedly included senators, aristocrats, and military officers who understood they were participating in what amounted to a coup attempt. By marrying Silius while still married to Claudius, Messalina was creating a legal framework for transferring imperial power to her new husband while maintaining her own position as Augusta. The political implications were staggering. Roman law recognized only one legitimate marriage at a time, meaning that Messalina's marriage to Silius technically invalidated her marriage to Claudius. If this interpretation gained legal recognition, it would make Britannicus, her son with Claudius, illegitimate and remove him from the line of imperial succession. Simultaneously, it would position Silius as the legitimate imperial consort, with all the political authority that position entailed. But the marriage to Silius was only the most visible element of a broader conspiracy that ancient sources suggest had been developing for years. Archaeological evidence and contemporary documents indicate that Messalina had been systematically placing her supporters in key military and administrative positions throughout the empire. She had accumulated enormous personal wealth through corrupt practices, including the confiscation of property from political enemies and the sale of government positions to the highest bidders. The scope of Messalina's corruption network becomes clear when examining the list of her alleged victims. Tacitus and Cassius Dio provide detailed accounts of senators, wealthy merchants, and even members of the imperial family who were executed or forced into exile on charges orchestrated by the empress. In each case, their property was confiscated and redistributed among Messalina's supporters, creating a system of legalized theft that funded her political operations. One of the most revealing episodes involves the fate of Decimus Valerius Asiaticus, a wealthy senator who owned extensive properties and commanded significant political influence. According to ancient sources, Messalina coveted his gardens on the Palatine Hill and orchestrated false accusations of treason against him. When Asiaticus was forced to commit suicide to avoid execution, his property was immediately transferred to imperial control, and Messalina began using his gardens for her most elaborate sexual entertainments. The Asiaticus case demonstrates the sophisticated methods Messalina used to eliminate potential threats while enriching herself and her allies. She didn't simply accuse people of crimes. She created elaborate scenarios that made their guilt appear credible to outside observers. False witnesses were produced, forged documents were planted, and carefully orchestrated events were staged to provide evidence of treasonous activity. The resulting executions appear to be legitimate exercises of imperial justice rather than politically motivated murders. Contemporary sources suggest that Messalina's methods were so effective that they created a climate of terror among the Roman aristocracy. Senators never knew when they might become targets, and the only protection was maintaining good relations with the empress through participation in her corrupt network. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where moral compromise became a survival necessity, and traditional Roman values were systematically undermined by the practical requirements of political survival. The psychological impact of living under such conditions was profound. Ancient letters and private documents that survived from this period reveal aristocrats struggling with the moral implications of their choices while recognizing that refusal to participate in Messalina's schemes often meant death. Some tried to maintain their integrity by limiting their involvement to the minimum necessary for survival, while others embraced corruption as a path to personal advancement. The economic impact of Messalina's activities was equally significant. The constant confiscation and redistribution of property disrupted normal commercial relationships and created uncertainty about property rights that affected investment and economic growth throughout the empire. Wealthy individuals began moving their assets out of Rome or converting them into forms that were difficult to confiscate, leading to capital flight and reduced economic activity in the imperial capital. Religious and cultural institutions also suffered under Messalina's regime. Traditional Roman religious practices, which emphasized moral purity and social order, became increasingly irrelevant in a world where success depended on sexual compromise and political corruption. Temples that had served as centers of community moral authority found themselves marginalized or co-opted into supporting the empress's activities through financial donations or ceremonial participation. The international implications of Messalina's behavior were also significant. Foreign ambassadors and client rulers who visited Rome were exposed to the empress's activities, leading to widespread perception that the Roman Empire was being governed by corrupt and immoral leaders. This perception undermined Roman diplomatic influence and made it more difficult to maintain control over distant provinces where local leaders began questioning the legitimacy of imperial authority. Military discipline, traditionally one of Rome's greatest strengths, was also affected by Messalina's influence. Officers who gained promotion through personal relationships with the empress were often unqualified for their positions, leading to decreased effectiveness in frontier defense and provincial administration. The famous Roman military meritocracy, where advancement was based on competence and achievement, was increasingly replaced by a system where political connections and sexual favors determined career advancement. However, what was about to happen would exceed all expectations and reveal secrets that had remained hidden for millennia, as Messalina's marriage to Silius triggered a chain of events that would expose the full extent of her political conspiracy and lead to the most dramatic confrontation in Imperial Roman history. The news of Messalina's marriage to Silius reached Claudius through his most trusted freedman, Narcissus, who understood immediately that the emperor's life was in mortal danger. According to Tacitus, Narcissus didn't simply report the marriage. He presented it as part of a comprehensive coup attempt that threatened not only Claudius's throne but his very survival. The evidence was overwhelming. Silius had been seen wearing imperial regalia, Messalina had been conducting official business as his wife, and their supporters were already positioning themselves for a transfer of power. Claudius's initial reaction was characteristic of the man who had survived decades of imperial politics through careful calculation rather than impulsive action. Instead of rushing back to Rome in a fury, he methodically gathered evidence and built a case against the conspirators. But Narcissus understood that hesitation could be fatal in this situation. While Claudius deliberated, Messalina and Silius were consolidating their control over key military units and government officials in Rome. The confrontation that followed revealed the true extent of Messalina's political network and the sophistication of her long-term planning. Ancient sources describe a city divided between competing loyalties, with some units of the Praetorian Guard supporting Claudius while others have been compromised by Messalina's influence. Senators were forced to choose sides publicly, many of them terrified that their previous involvement in the empress's activities would be exposed regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed. Messalina's behavior during these crucial days demonstrates both her political acumen and her ultimate miscalculation of Claudius's character. According to Cassius Dio, she initially attempted to negotiate from a position of strength, sending messages to Claudius that portrayed her marriage to Silius as a political necessity rather than a personal betrayal. She argued that their son Britannicus needed a more capable protector than his aging, sickly father, and that Silius represented the best hope for maintaining imperial stability. But Messalina had fundamentally misunderstood the man she had been married to for a decade. Claudius's apparent weakness and scholarly detachment masked a calculating intelligence that had enabled him to survive and ultimately thrive in one of history's most dangerous political environments. When he finally decided to act, his response was swift, comprehensive, and utterly ruthless. The trial and execution of the conspirators revealed the full scope of Messalina's activities to the Roman public for the first time. Witnesses testified about the sexual competitions, the forced prostitution of senators' wives, the systematic corruption of government positions, and the elaborate blackmail schemes that had funded the conspiracy. The testimony was so shocking that even experienced Roman politicians, accustomed to political violence and moral compromise, were horrified by the revelations. Silius was executed immediately, along with dozens of his supporters. Their property was confiscated and their families exiled or killed, depending on their level of involvement in the conspiracy. But Messalina herself presented a more complex problem for Claudius. As his wife and the mother of his son, she couldn't simply be executed like the other conspirators without creating additional political complications. The final confrontation between Claudius and Messalina took place in the gardens that she had stolen from Decimus Valerius Asiaticus, a location that contemporary sources suggest was deliberately chosen for its symbolic significance. Surrounded by the luxury that she had accumulated through years of corruption and violence, Messalina made her final attempt to save her life through the same sexual manipulation that had brought her to power. Ancient historians describe a woman who had lost none of her physical attractiveness or psychological cunning, even in the face of certain death. She allegedly threw herself at Claudius's feet, reminded him of their shared history and their son's welfare, and offered to abandon all political activities in exchange for her life. For a moment, according to Tacitus, Claudius wavered, moved by memories of their early marriage and concern for Britannicus's future. But Narcissus understood that any mercy shown to Messalina would be interpreted as weakness and would inevitably lead to future conspiracies. While Claudius hesitated, his freedman took matters into his own hands and ordered the Praetorian Guards to execute the empress immediately. Messalina died at age 28, killed by the same political system she had tried to manipulate and control. The immediate aftermath of Messalina's death revealed the true extent of her influence over Roman society. Dozens of aristocratic families discovered that their wives, daughters, or sisters had been involved in the empress's activities, creating a crisis of moral authority that affected every level of Roman social hierarchy. The revelation that some of Rome's most prominent women had participated in prostitution competitions and sexual blackmail schemes shattered traditional assumptions about feminine virtue and aristocratic dignity. The economic impact was equally severe. The systematic confiscation and redistribution of property under Messalina's regime had disrupted normal commercial relationships throughout the empire. When Claudius attempted to restore stolen property to its rightful owners, he discovered that much of it had been sold, consumed, or integrated into complex financial arrangements that couldn't be easily unwound. The result was years of legal disputes and economic uncertainty that affected Roman prosperity long after the empress's death. Claudius himself was profoundly changed by the experience. The man who had once trusted his wife completely became suspicious of everyone around him, including his own children and closest advisors. His remaining years as emperor were characterized by increasing paranoia and isolation, as he struggled to rebuild the moral authority and political stability that Messalina's activities had destroyed. The fate of Britannicus, Messalina's son with Claudius, illustrates the long-term consequences of her actions. Despite being the emperor's biological heir, the boy was permanently tainted by his mother's reputation and ultimately excluded from the imperial succession. When Claudius remarried to his niece Agrippina, her son Nero became the favored heir, setting in motion the events that would lead to Britannicus's eventual murder and the continuation of imperial instability. The historical sources that preserved Messalina's story were written by men who had lived through her reign of terror and witnessed its devastating consequences firsthand. Their accounts, while possibly exaggerated in some details, reflect the genuine trauma experienced by Roman society during this period. The empress had demonstrated that traditional moral and legal constraints meant nothing when confronted by determined political ambition backed by sexual manipulation and systematic corruption. Modern archaeological evidence supports many aspects of the ancient accounts. Excavations in the imperial palaces have revealed elaborate entertainment facilities that match descriptions of Messalina's sexual competitions, while analysis of contemporary financial records confirms the systematic theft and redistribution of property described by ancient historians. The physical evidence suggests that whatever the exact details of her activities, Messalina's impact on Roman society was both real and profound. The legacy of Messalina's reign extends far beyond her personal story to reveal fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system that would ultimately contribute to Rome's decline and fall, while her name became synonymous with the corruption of power and the destruction of moral authority. The story of Valeria Messalina represents one of history's most extreme examples of power corruption and political manipulation, but it also reveals deeper truths about the nature of imperial authority and the impossible pressures faced by women in positions of unofficial power. Her rise and fall illuminated fundamental contradictions in Roman society that would plague the empire for centuries. The gap between public moral standards and private behavior, the tension between traditional values and political necessity, and the devastating consequences when personal ambition overwhelms institutional constraints. What makes Messalina's story particularly compelling is not just its sensational details, but its demonstration of how individual corruption can systematically undermine social institutions. Her activities didn't simply affect the imperial court. They created a culture of moral compromise that spread throughout Roman society, corrupting senators, generals, merchants, and aristocratic families across the empire. The sexual competitions and blackmail schemes were symptoms of a deeper problem: the concentration of unlimited power in the hands of individuals who faced no meaningful checks on their authority. The modern relevance of Messalina's story lies not in its sexual content, but in its political implications. Throughout history, societies have struggled with the challenge of constraining power while maintaining effective government. Messalina's career demonstrates what happens when institutional safeguards fail and personal relationships replace legal procedures as the basis for political decision-making. The corruption networks she created, the systematic theft of property, and the erosion of moral authority have parallels in many modern political systems. Perhaps most significantly, Messalina's story reveals the gendered nature of political power in societies where women are officially excluded from authority but unofficially expected to influence political outcomes. Her extreme methods may have been unique, but her underlying situation, navigating political dangers without official position or legal protections, reflects challenges that powerful women have faced throughout history. The tools she chose were shaped by the constraints she faced, and her ultimate failure was as much a product of systemic limitations as personal moral failings. The historical sources that preserved Messalina's story were written by her political enemies and reflect their perspectives on her activities. Modern historians debate how much of the ancient accounts represents actual events versus political propaganda designed to discredit her memory. But regardless of the exact details, the fundamental pattern is clear. Unchecked power inevitably leads to abuse, and when that abuse becomes systematic, it undermines the entire political system. The lesson of Messalina's reign is not that power corrupts individuals, but that societies must develop institutional mechanisms to prevent the concentration of unlimited authority in any person's hands. Her story serves as a warning about the dangers of political systems that depend on personal virtue rather than structural constraints, and about the devastating consequences when those systems fail. The empress who shocked Rome with her sexual competitions ultimately destroyed herself, but the damage she inflicted on Roman society lasted for generations and contributed to the gradual collapse of imperial authority. 2,000 years later, Messalina remains a powerful symbol of the corruption of power and the importance of institutional restraints on political authority. If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, subscribe now, leave a like, and share in the comments what you think about the role of institutional constraints in preventing political corruption. Until the next video.